Hello and welcome to The Real Questions, a program that features opinions, facts and advice from academics and industry experts. Today I'm here with Dr. Vic Benyena, an organizational psychologist and labor market researcher. Today we'll be interviewing on the topic of making the labor force in developing countries more competitive. Welcome, Dr. Benyena. It's lovely to have you with me in the studio today.
My pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
You're more than welcome. So I would like to start off with, if you can just talk to me a little bit more about the nature of the labour market in general and how this helps improve productivity and GDP.
Okay, thank you. The labour market is very, very important to the growth of GDP in every country. There isn't a country on the planet that is not in favor of GDP growth. We have had issues in the past. Japan, for example, has had some issues in terms of GDP growth. Some countries in Europe have had issues. But also there were some positives. China was growing at about 6.7% at some point, Vietnam 7.1%, India 7.1%. Nigeria took a dip 2 years ago at 1.9%, 2.1%. But this might be happening because the labor market has had some irregularities. So there's a link between the labor force efficiencies and effectiveness and the productive capacity of countries. If you get the labor market right, your capital is right, then GDP is likely to go up. In macroeconomic theory, or also for that matter, economic theory as a whole, we learn about the factors of production, and these include land, capital, entrepreneurship, and most importantly, labor. The labor affects the labor market. We sell the labor and buy the labor in the labor market. So it's quite important that we focus more on the nature, the structure, the competitiveness of the labor force in the labor market. And this includes looking at the skills provided to the people that comprise the labor force, the knowledge that they have, the attitudes that they have. So the nature, broadly speaking, would be to look at what exactly is the structure of the labor force in a country. What exactly happens to the movement of labor from one region to the other, even if it's within the same country. It turns out that there are some features of labor, and these include labor being inelastic. And inelastic means that within the short run, within the short period, it's not possible to train labor very quickly, even if the market needs an increase in the labor force. So that presents some challenges to the individual as well as the employers. Labor is also indispensable, but also labor is inseparable from human beings. In other words, human beings deliver what we call labor in the market or to organizations. So if the qualities of the human being are questionable, then the labor force itself is going to have a problem. But also, we can look at labor in terms of its movement. Is labor easily adaptable? Can we move engineers to become doctors within a short period of time? Probably not. This is one of the reasons why structural unemployment occurs. If one sector doesn't need the skills that were there previously, and these skills or this labor force has to be retrained to move to another sector, it presents some challenge because it takes time to retrain. But another feature of the labor market is that it is now very competitive. If you look at countries that rely on international labor, countries in the Middle East, some countries in Europe, and also organizations in the Silicon Valley, for example, in the United States, that rely heavily on international labor, then it's important that these economies that rely on the international labor are recruiting the best. And if they are recruiting the best, then that makes the labor market very competitive. And therefore, we cannot say that even if in our own countries, say, for example, a country like Cameroon, if there are certain cultural practices from the human being that affect the labor force or the labor of that individual, if those cultural practices inhibit the movement of people from Cameroon to the international market, it's not okay to say that those cultural variables should continue to exist in this individual. We have to leave them behind, make adjustment to the cultural abilities of this particular individual when they join the labor market. Take, for example, people who work in the Middle East, whether they are in the skilled sector or the unskilled sector. There are some cultural adjustments that have to be made. Most countries in the Middle East are Islamic countries. Most people who are coming from Africa or Asia, for example, aren't likely to be Muslims necessarily, and therefore some adjustment has to be made to be able to fit into the labor market. It is competitive, and individuals who fail to make these adjustments to their own personal views, their personal behaviors, attitudes, then they're not likely to be competitive. So the overall labor market, the nature of the overall labor market across the world is very, very important for anyone who wants to either recruit or anyone seeking to join the global labor force. I hope I have answered your question, but if you need more clarification about this, then I'm happy to.
I'm sure we'll cover a lot more in depth throughout the interview, but thank you very much. Okay, in your earlier comment, you talked about the relationship between labor and productivity. What are the improvement strategies required right now to enhance the quality of labor in Sub-Saharan Africa?
Yeah, a lot actually. We have to look at examples from outside Africa. The debate that African problems have to be addressed from African perspective is misleading. I believe that we have to look at examples of South Korea, Japan. We have to look at examples from North America, United Kingdom, and to some extent, United Arab Emirates, Singapore, also in the Far East. So in terms of improvements, I would say, let's look at the example of United Arab Emirates. What is the government doing in terms of skill development? Well, the government has opened up for entrepreneurial skills to be developed. And this includes students in tertiary institutions being asked to graduate companies. And that's something I've never heard before in my academic life. To graduate companies means by the time you leave your 3-year degree or by the time you finish your 4-year degree, you should have come up with a business idea that is scalable, that is going to make money, that's going to create jobs for other people. So Africa has to do the same. University of Ghana, Makerere University, University of Lagos, University of Pretoria, University of Jomo Kenyatta University in Kenya, and all the universities in Sub-Saharan Africa have to start thinking more entrepreneurially. If they do that, then the win is not just one. It's going to be in terms of job creation. It's going to be in terms of higher productivity, because the private sector tends to be more productive than the government sector. So that's one example from the United Arab Emirates. But in addition to that, let's look at examples from South Korea. How did they do it? How did South Korea become so energetic in terms of car manufacturing? Well, they contacted the Germans, who historically have been very good in terms of car manufacturing. They brought the German engineers to South Korea. They helped them to become more effective in terms of how they carry out the engineering of car manufacturing. And today, Kia, Hyundai, and several other organizations in South Korea have created jobs for the people of Korea and also people from the region around South Korea. So I believe that Uganda, Kenya can also look at these examples from South Korea. Then we can look at examples from Europe, particularly UK, because UK has a lot of influence in Africa. This influence, some say, has caused problems. I slightly disagree, and I know I'm digressing from the question a little bit, but the whole idea that the colonial era has caused problems to Africa, I personally don't agree to that. Take, for example, people who say that the negatives of the colonial era present some problem to the development of Africa. Imagine a country like Nigeria with over 520 languages. How are they going to organize their productive abilities within this mixture of languages? But now the colonial era created a language which is not only exclusive to Africa, by the way. The English language is now cherished by several countries across the world. So improvements in English language in the African continent is key, or maybe French in the countries such as Congo, part of Cameroon, and the other countries that speak French. But I believe that by following the trend provided by UK for several years, by looking at the universities in UK and how they teach young people, what kind of subjects they teach, what is the emphasis on research. If we do these sort of things in Africa, then I believe that over the next 10 years or so, perhaps 2 decades, then Africa would have a role to play in the global economy. So in terms of recommendations to ensure that this skill set that we have in Africa currently is ready for the next growth, these are some of the examples that we have to look at. And I'm completely against the idea that Africa problems have to be addressed by Africa perspectives or Africa expertise. I'll add a few more points to this. The fact remains that if you look at the greatest inventions in the world, perhaps none have come from Africa. That's not a criticism. It's a fact. And the African community has to start looking at this, that why do we continue to point fingers at other people for whatever reason? And we have not been able to create things that are needed in Africa. Why does a country like Ghana have to import toothpick from China? That's a clear example. Toothpick is made from bamboo. But the Chinese go to Ghana and perhaps other Sub Saharan African countries. They buy the bamboo, take it to China, process it, and then export this toothpick to Africa. So why can't the University of Science and Technology in Ghana, the other scientific institutions across the east part of Africa, why can't they start creating the things that are needed in Africa in a way that will help to develop the continent, rather than continuously accusing other people from historical periods up till now, in terms of why Africa is still underdeveloped. So I believe we have to change the mindset in Africa. We have to start thinking more about how do we compete with the rest of the world? How do we play a role? How do we ensure that the next generation is skilled enough to produce in Africa instead of migrating to other parts of the world? So
very interesting. So following on quite nicely from that, can you please explain to me the importance of college and university education in improving the labour market in Africa?
Yeah, sure. A lot of people say that the best entrepreneurs in the world have no college education. But also, there is evidence to suggest that there are a number of entrepreneurs who have got college education. So if I have a young person from Africa who walks to me and asks the question, should I really go to university or should I just set up my own business? And my advice would be go to university. University does not only provide you the skill to be employable, it also opens your mind. It creates awareness, it provides you more knowledge, it allows you to be critical in your decision making, it allows you to vote much better than if you weren't educated. So in terms of what the universities have to do, I think your question was about...
So can you explain to me the role that colleges and university education will play in improving the labour market in Africa?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I was actually on course. So here are a key number of things that the universities in Africa have to do. First of all, there has to be much more research engagement. There has to be much more research production from Africa in terms of STEM, science, technology, engineering, mathematics. These are the key areas that will drive the continent forward. So the over-reliance, and I've said this a number of times in my writing, the over-reliance on subjects that don't directly lead to production, it's not going to help that much. I'm not saying we should completely stop teaching subjects that are not STEM. Of course, I didn't do STEM. STEM subjects propel countries like China, India forward. So universities in Africa have to focus more on this. Unfortunately, the universities in Africa have kind of misaligned their priorities. Take, for example, Kwame Nkrumah University of Science and Technology in Ghana. It's meant to be science and technology university. But what we tend to find is that they have, over the years, created more university courses in the area of economics, business, humanities, even to some extent, history and archaeology and that sort of subject. So that is not really what we should see in a university that calls itself science and technology. Again, University of Ghana has the same misalignment. So I believe that it's important for the universities to be really focused on what they have put in their mission and vision statement, focus on that instead of prioritizing money-making and providing education that is not meaningful. The other area is we have to change the way teaching is done in universities. So at the moment, university classes have, on the average, about 30 students per class. That's above the average that you find in UK, for example. UK, for a very long time, according to the QAA in UK, has preferred that a class size of 15 is probably more effective. So the African universities have to notice that if you have too many students in the class, then the per capita knowledge acquisition of this individual is not going to be the same as if you have a smaller sizes. Then, of course, the mindset of our professors in Africa. Are the professors looking at themselves as the most important person within the provision of education? Or are they looking at themselves as the partner in the provision of education? Are they applying authoritative method of teaching, or are they applying different methods such as flipping the classroom, allowing the students to use hands-on activities to achieve knowledge? Or are they using the traditional method 60 years ago, 50 years ago, where the professor stands in front of the class and delivers a lecture for 1 hour, 30 minutes, walks away, sets exam, and tests the ability of the student based on how they perform in the exam? We have to adopt more can-do attitude within the university setting. We have to ensure that there are practical elements of course provision in the university. But quite apart from that also, we have to link our strategy to the government strategy. And maybe it should be the other way around. The government has to define the goals of the universities, set standards, and make it more competitive. The government has to ensure, or the governments of these countries in Africa have to ensure that there are KPIs, key performance indicators for each university. It's done in United Arab Emirates. Every year, the government wants to see what you've achieved as an institution. Universities in Ghana, Kenya, the rest of Africa have to also start doing that by making things a little bit more competitive, particularly in terms of inventions, science, discovery, and also the needs of the health sector in Africa in particular. By doing all these things, then the country can become more independent. So those will be my recommendations to improve the alignment of the labor force within the African context.
Brilliant. Now, Dr. Vic, we know that you are a labor market researcher. From the research that you've conducted, why might attitude be a key factor in recruitment decisions?
Yeah, it's a critical question. And I have always read about attitude within the labor market. I have read about attitude, and I have done some work on attitude management as well. From a recruiter's point of view, it turns out that majority, perhaps in the region of 70% of employers, prefer to recruit people for their attitude and train them for their skill. I'm going to repeat that. They recruit people for their attitude, positive attitude, and then train them for the skill required to do the job. So Google, for example, recently has stopped using or recruiting people with degrees, fancy degrees. They want to see if you can do the job. So if you have the positive attitude, you're more than likely to get a job. But if you have the not so good attitude, but you have tons of qualifications, you're not likely to cross that bridge to getting unemployment. The labor market is very competitive right now. And so the recruiters have to make a decision on factors other than qualification and experience. If you take 10 different people from 10 different countries, you're more than likely to see the same level of qualification across board. If it's Master of Science in IT from India, it's going to be Master of Science in IT from China, Nigeria, Cameroon, United States, UK, and Ireland. So how do you decide on who to recruit to do the job? It boils down to attitude. And this attitude is phenomenal. It's phenomenal because these days, no one really wants to recruit someone who is going to create problems for them. No one really wants to recruit someone who would be told to do XYZ functions in the workplace, and they will moan about it, they will complain about it. I don't think most countries these days are really keen on even their attitude towards unions, for example. I know I'm digressing a little bit, but I would like to emphasize this point. How do we view the relationship between the employer and the employee? In some countries, this is defined by the unions that we have. In Germany, the unions are very strong. In fact, employees are on the board of most organizations in terms of decision making. In Africa, there are also unions in Ghana and Nigeria. But in terms of the individual attitude, coming together on the aggregate, defining this union relationship, how does that affect the productivity of the country? And I tend to see more strikes in Africa that affect the labor market. I see a lot more strike, which in my view, is just that the employees want more and more every time. I know the World Bank has put the living wage for most countries at a very, very low level, that there's not enough income in these countries. But at the same time, do we use these unions to affect productivity? And then we have less income. And then the less income is then used to pay you less money. And if the less money is paid to you, then you complain. It's kind of cyclical. So to break this cycle, I believe that we have to know that there has to be some give and take. And this is defined within the context of attitude. Another area of attitude that I would like to talk about is how do we respond to flexibility? Now we have COVID-19, and lots of people around the world are going to be losing their job or have already lost their job. How do we deal with this difficult situation at the individual level? How do we deal with moving a job rotation, for example? If your employer asks you to move from one location to the other, are you going to complain about it and quit your job? If your employer, as a result of cost cutting, have reduced your salary, would you quit the job or would you stay? Actually, a lot of people quit their job if they can get just about 10% increase in their salary. They move to another job. But one lesson I've learned in England is that people stay on the same job for a very long time. And that's commitment. So that level of commitment also comes with responsibility. It also comes with job satisfaction. If you are more likely to be committed to your employer, stay with the same organization for a very long time, then you will feel more self-actualized. You will feel more fulfilled, rather than thinking that, oh, well, I know of another employer who's going to increase my salary by just 2%, therefore I'm quitting and then moving on. What about the knowledge that you are acquiring from your existing job? So attitude is a big thing, and we can go on and on and on forever. But also, I would like to finish this particular question by localizing the conversation to, again, developing countries. How do we see the effect of divine intervention, for example? And I don't mean the Abrahamic God at all. What I mean here is there are a lot of petty God affiliations in Africa and also to some extent in India and South America, Haiti being one of the cases. In Africa, for example, people go to these fetish priests or black magicians to influence their chances of getting into the labor market. But that's very misleading. I prefer that in terms of that, people work much harder, they become more competitive, they get their skills right, instead of going to a black magician in Nigeria who then take money from them, making their situation worse. So we have to change our mindset. People in Africa, people in South America, people in India, and some parts of Asia have to change their mindset that to be effective in the labor market, to be effective and attractive to the employers, it's not about going to a black magician, it's not about forcing your way through, it's not about union activity, it's not about thinking that I'm the best, although you might not be. It's a complicated area, attitude is, and we can have a whole conversation on attitude. It probably will last about 2 hours. But yeah, attitude is key to the recruiters these days.
So it's a good overview for us, another topic of discussion for another time. So some economists believe that brain drain has a big impact on the development of an emerging country. Why do you think that is?
That is an interesting question. A lot of people have written on brain drain. There was one article written by Clemens, I think that was in the 90s. Clemens was a guy who was working in Oxford University. For a vast majority of people, including us academics, our belief is that brain drain is always negative. But if you look at it with a much closer focus, brain drain is not always negative. The other misconception is that brain drain only affects developing countries, but that's not true. There are a lot of British who work in North America. There are a lot of North Americans who work in Europe. There are a lot of Europeans who work in Southeast Asia. There are a lot of Chinese who migrate to United States. I'll give one particular statistics. There are over 2 million Nigerians in the United States alone. That's a huge number. But that in itself is not brain drain. Out of these 2 million, there are approximately 20,000 doctors from Nigeria or of Nigerian origin working in the United States. There are about 10,000 academics from Nigeria alone working in the United States. So these are huge numbers, and when you look at them immediately, you're like, wow, Nigeria is underdeveloped because of this perceived brain drain. But let's look at it in terms of how much money is repatriated by these 20,000 and 10,000 Nigerians working in the United States. If they do send money back to Nigeria, that is a foreign income flowing into Nigeria, and that's something that Nigeria can use to increase their GDP. So it's not always negative, there can be positive to it. But in terms of how it affects developing countries, yes, I agree. A vast majority of people leave Ethiopia, Iran, South Africa, and they go to other countries to work in these countries. And most of the time, it's the top of the cream. It's the cream of the cake that fall into this category. Of course, you don't expect low-skilled person or unskilled person to migrate to the countries that we're talking about, although they do for different reasons. Majority of the people who migrate to Europe, for example, from Africa, talking of Nigeria, Cameroon, the war-torn countries in Africa, to Europe, majority of them are unskilled. The ones that you see on TV, the ones that cross the Sahara Desert and then to Italy and making their way to UK, for example, majority of them are unskilled. So they don't fall within the category of brain drain. But if you look at the previous example of the Nigerian doctors and academics, that can potentially affect the country. Ethiopia has got the same thing. I think I've seen this somewhere, that about 25% of the trained professionals in Ethiopia migrate and leave the shores of Ethiopia. So yes, if those people stay within the country, then it is likely that they can make some contributions to the GDP of this country. But then that is not the only question we have to ask about brain drain. There is a third question. And this question is about, why are the people leaving the shores of Africa or Asia or even Europe? Why are they leaving? There has to be a push or a pull factor. And I think for most of the developing countries, including Africa, majority of the push factors work to make the brain drain occur much more than the pull factor. For example, last week I was reading the news about power in Nigeria and Ghana. And up till today, the Nigerian government is not able to provide a sustainable electricity for most communities in in Nigeria. And so if that doctor who was trained to become successful in Nigeria is disabled, technically speaking, because they are not able to implement what they have learned in college, and they get frustrated because when they carry out an operation, the light goes off, the standby generator kicks in a few minutes after that. That will be frustrating to anyone who works in such environment, and hence the reason why they leave the shores. My advice in connection with this would be that the government has to be able to provide more jobs for the people who are leaving. I don't think that people are living purely because they find United States more attractive. They don't find UK necessarily attractive or other countries necessarily more attractive. If the governments can create the opportunities back in the home countries, I believe there will be a reverse brain drain where the people who have left several years ago will come back and then make contribution to their country. So in summary, yes, brain drain can affect the development of most countries, but it's not exclusive to Africa. It's not exclusive to Asia. In my experience when I was in Vietnam, there were a lot of Europeans and Americans in Vietnam. So, and these people were very trained in their countries. They were teachers or medical doctors. So yes, it's misleading, and I want to correct this once and for all that brain drain is always negative to the developing country. It can be beneficial, but also brain drain is not only a phenomenon that happens in Africa, it happens all over the world.
Thank you very much. So some people might say that your views could be quite critical of Sub-Saharan Africa. What would your response be to these people?
Okay. First of all, human beings have the inclination to be critical. We tend to be more critical than accepting of values and facts and opinions. This is why opinions vary. So I don't think I'm overly critical. I'm just highlighting in the books that I write and the speeches that I give that, I'm just highlighting the same thing that everyone is thinking about. Take, for example, in terms of being critical, I believe a lot of people in Kenya are equally critical. And I'll explain in this way. They are critical, if it's about a parent, they are critical of the government. So when it comes to election time, if they don't like the existing ruling government, they change. That's been critical. Second, when people are going to, when people send their kids to schools, private schools in particular, they are probably criticizing the government schools, because you have to criticize the government schools to be able to send your kid to a private one. If you think that a government school is good, why then do you send your kid to a private one? So the same issue I have highlighted in my book about ineffective government practices as far as education is concerned, individuals, ordinary individuals in Africa have done the same thing. They have done that more through their actions than vocalizing it or perhaps writing it down. Those are two examples I've given, but I've also seen that I'm not the only one who is having this perspective about developing countries not doing much. There are other professors who write on the subject as well, but it's also a sensitive issue. A lot of people avoid talking about sensitive issues to keep their jobs or perhaps to please other people. And my approach is, as long as we continue running away from the truth, as long as we continue sweeping it under the carpet, then developing countries are not going to continue, they are not going to be able to catch up with the developed world. And I hate to use the word developing versus develop. In one of my projects, I have decided to use the phrases users versus makers. That provides much better balance for us in terms of the academic discourse. So as to whether my views are critical or not critical, I believe is a subject of who is looking at it and what my intentions are. My intention is, if I confront the issues, if I have an open discussion about them, then hopefully we will be able to progress much better than we are currently. So this my take on whether I'm being too critical or whether my views are appropriate for the current African development.
Brilliant. Okay, and my final question for you today is, what advice and recommendations do you have for universities and policymakers in emerging countries as well as Sub-Saharan Africa?
Thank you. Advice for the colleges and universities. First of all, I don't think I qualify to provide advice to the universities in Africa. I think they have great professors, great vice chancellors out there. They have great politicians in Africa who can make the best decisions. But they have to make those best decisions for the people of Africa, not for other people who are signing contracts with them and probably making decisions that are not the optimum. My advice would be that the African universities start rethinking their strategy. I've mentioned this earlier on, but I think there is more to be done in terms of research. Malaria has been in Africa for a very long time. Sickle cell disease has been in Africa for a very long time. Why can't the universities in Africa? The number of universities in Nigeria, for example, is more than the universities in UK. I think the United Kingdom has about 130 universities. The number of Nigerian universities is about 152. Yet, it takes Liverpool University to experiment on malaria eradication. I believe there are universities in Nigeria, Ghana, and Uganda who are also experimenting on this. But the universities have to speed up, make it more competitive. What's wrong with giving a target to the science departments of various universities that if you come out with a cure for malaria within the next 5 years, you're going to win an award in the region of maybe $10 million. I believe governments in Africa can do this. What is wrong with telling technological universities in Africa that if you come out with a great vehicle that is appropriate for the terrains of Africa? We know the terrains of Africa. The roads are in bad shape. But then we import European or Japanese cars and drive them on these broken roads. What about giving a target to the engineering department? Create a vehicle that is appropriate for the African terrain. And if you can do this within 5 years, then you get a prize of maybe $10 million. Why don't challenge the people to do this? We cannot resort to the status quo. We cannot continue to teach science from the textbook. It's not done in China. Science has to be done through the fingertips. You know, use your fingers, make your hands dirty and get things done instead of relying on science textbooks. Then in the area of research, more has to be done. Research affect development. So if the African institutions have to, if the African universities can engage in more research, then it's likely that the overall continent is going to move forward. The other element that I would like to talk about in terms of advice for the colleges and universities is getting their priorities right. And I think I mentioned that a little bit earlier on. But I cannot expect a science university to be teaching humanities. The private institutions in some countries in Africa are becoming even institutions of excellence compared to the government ones. Why is this happening? The government institutions, the government universities in the UK are the core of research. They are the core of academic excellence, not the other way around. But you see universities such as Ashesi University in Ghana, you see universities such as Cavendish in Uganda, and some other private institutions in Nigeria becoming much better in terms of quality compared to the Ghanaian, the government versions. So if the private sector can do it better, I believe the government sector can do it too. And so the government has to do much more than they are doing currently, change the mindset of the professors. I teach in the Middle East at the moment, and I don't particularly think that I'm the guru in my delivery of education. I look at it as a partnership. The professors in Africa have to start looking at education provision as a partnership. Let the students do the work. Let the students do the activities. The internet has taken away the expertise that professors used to have. If a student wants to know more about how to create, say, a rocket, for example, they can just Google it. They can learn it from there. So as a professor in Africa, you have to go beyond that Google knowledge and provide something that is much more meaningful for the student, make them motivated, create the environment that supports their ambitions, let them know that you are there to support them and you are not there to intimidate them. One of the most confusing things in Africa is that the professor can just decide to fail the students arbitrarily if they feel like doing so. But you can't do that. There has to be a much better framework in place to check this sort of behaviors. I have heard of stories, although not substantiated, that some professors create pamphlets. They create mini books for their students to use in their class. And if a student is unable to buy this book, then they're not likely to get a good grade. But that's not the way to do it. It's a very corrupt way of teaching the next generation that to propel the countries in Africa. So again, it's a big conversation. We can have it for 1 hour in terms of what the African institutions have to do, but these are some key areas that the institutions in Africa have to start looking at to be much more competitive going forward.
Lovely. Well, that concludes our interview today with Dr. Vic Benyena. And we thank you for tuning in. We hope you enjoyed this week's topic, and we look forward to seeing you next time on The Real Questions.